Anastasia Palaszczuk, the Queensland Premier, coincidentally it seems, releasing a letter she wrote to the PM yesterday asking that ADF be kept on to help with border control. Let's have a look at this letter. She released it today. The Premier's letter, or her deputy did, Steve Miles, said, "I write to you regarding the involvement of the Australian Defence Force in Queensland's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The ADF has continued to play a critical role in keeping Queenslanders safe through the pandemic. I also appreciate the commitment provided by you that the ADF will continue to support Queensland's quarantine monitoring program." Lieutenant General John Fruin advised that ADF support for border operations would conclude on 30th September 2020. He has acknowledged that ADF will continue to support Queensland's pandemic response, but this does not include border control. I understand this is inconsistent with the approach taken with other jurisdictions, including New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia and the Northern Territory. I request that you consider providing an extension to the provision of this ADF support until at least 19th of October 2020. So there you go. She's having a shot back. Daniel Andrews wasn't getting the ADF quick enough. Anastasia Palaszczuk say, hey, why are you pulling him out? Well, Scott Morrison could say, well, because you should be opening the borders. This followed Josh Frydenberg comments, the Treasurer's comments on 4BC this morning.
As the Queensland government said, that the federal government has deliberately pulled the Australian Defence Force off our borders to try and damage their border policy. Did the federal government do that?
That sounds like rubbish. I mean, seriously. We have used the Defence Force to support the states at every opportunity. As you know, we've deployed them in multiple states to help the states deal with whether it's the quarantine issues, whether it's testing and tracing, whether it's logistics.
To which Anastasia Palaszczuk's deputy Stephen Miles came out and released the letter and had a real crack.
Anastasia Palaszczuk has written to the Prime Minister about ADF being taken away from border control. Within it, she says, I understand this is inconsistent with the approach taken with other jurisdictions, including New South Wales and Victoria. Were you aware that Anastasia Palaszczuk was writing to the Prime Minister?
No.
And do you agree with her stance on border controls to use ADF?
The Queensland border is a matter for the Queensland government, and how those arrangements are enforced. They're so far away from the work that I'm doing that, frankly, I don't have time to speculate on that. That's, if she's written to the Prime Minister, I haven't seen the letter. The letter's not addressed to me. I'd leave it to them, the two of them, to sort that out.
I've also now provided to you a letter from the Premier, subsequently sent to the Prime Minister, making it very, very clear that we would support the Army's ongoing support on our borders. This is yet another example of a federal government minister being sent out by the Prime Minister to attack our government in the local media here in Queensland, being caught out lying. And I think it's time, again, for Josh Frydenberg to apologise for the statements that he made this morning. It is time for the federal government to stop using the Australian Defence Force, which after all is for all Australians, to stop using them as a bargaining chip in their war against our COVID-19 restrictions.
So before Steve Miles there, we had Daniel Andrews. He was saying he didn't know anything about the Anastasia Palaszczuk correspondence. Penned yesterday, the day Daniel Andrews knew that I was getting the Morrison letters, because the Victorian government asked last week who was the actual person who'd FOI'd these, and they'd been consulted on them, but he knew nothing about them. Fair enough. Stephen Miles, though, he was pretty strong about Josh Frydenberg, wasn't he, accusing him of lying. And Josh Frydenberg, he's had an interview with Kieran this afternoon, which we'll play later in the program, but he addressed both Stephen Miles and Daniel Andrews in this interview.
Andrew Clennell reporting via Freedom of Information that the PM urged the Premier in July to accept ADF support. He says it was critical in terms of contact tracing and so on, that be done properly. How difficult was it to get the Victorian government to accept that assistance at the time?
Kieran, this was written confirmation of what we have known all along, that the federal government had offered ADF support to Victoria. Unfortunately, Victoria turned that down in favour of private security guards.
The Deputy Premier in Queensland has had a go at you. He says that you've been lying about the federal government's withdrawal of some level of support from the ADF in terms of their border supports. He wants you to apologise.
He's a fool. I mean, the reality is we have provided support to Queensland and will continue to provide support to Queensland.